The Whitmore mansion stood like a palace against the night sky, its windows blazing with golden light that spilled across manicured lawns. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on marble floors so polished they reflected the guests like mirrors. This was the annual charity gala, where the city's wealthiest gathered to see and be seen, their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos worth more than most people's homes. But hidden in the servants' quarters, 10-year-old Samuel pressed his face against a crack in the door, watching the spectacle unfold. His mother, Maria, had been working at the Whitmore estate for 3 years, cleaning these same floors that now hosted the city's elite. Tonight was different, though. The regular babysitter had canceled last minute, and Maria had no choice but to bring Samuel along. "Stay here," she had whispered, her dark eyes filled with worry. "No matter what you hear, no matter how curious you get, do not leave this room. Promise me, Samuel." He had promised, but promises were hard to keep when music drifted through the walls and laughter echoed down the hallways. Samuel's fingers twitched unconsciously, remembering the feel of piano keys under his touch. It had been 3 years since he'd played, 3 years since they'd lost everything, and his mother had taken this job to keep them alive. The boy's stomach rumbled. He'd eaten only a piece of bread for dinner, saving the rest for his mother, who worked 18-hour days. Through the crack, he watched servers carry silver trays loaded with delicacies he'd never tasted. Caviar, champagne, tiny pastries that probably cost more than their weekly groceries. As the evening wore on, Samuel noticed something. The main ballroom floor needed attention. Wine had been spilled near the piano, and muddy footprints tracked across the pristine marble. His mother would be mortified if she saw it. She took such pride in her work, often staying late to ensure everything was perfect. Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He grabbed the cleaning supplies from the closet, pulled on the yellow rubber gloves that were too big for his small hands, and quietly slipped into the ballroom. The party was in full swing, with most guests gathered around the bar area. He could clean the spill and be back in the servants' quarters before anyone noticed. The marble felt cold under his knees as he worked, scrubbing at the wine stain with careful precision. His mother had taught him well. Every surface deserved respect, she said, whether it belonged to them or not. The piano loomed above him, its ebony surface gleaming under the chandeliers. Samuel's heart ached looking at it. This was a Steinway grand, the kind of instrument he'd only dreamed of touching. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching, didn't realize the conversation had moved closer to the piano area. It wasn't until laughter erupted directly behind him that Samuel understood his terrible mistake. "Look at this," a man's voice boomed, thick with amusement and alcohol. The help's boy, wandering where he shouldn't be. Samuel's blood turned to ice. He clutched the mop handle tighter, his knuckles white beneath the rubber gloves. Around him, expensive shoes came into view. Silk gowns brushed against his peripheral vision. He had become the center of attention in the worst possible way. More voices joined in, each one cutting deeper than the last. Comments about his appearance, his presence, his very existence in their perfect world. Samuel wanted to explain that he was just trying to help, that he hadn't meant to intrude, but the words died in his throat. He had learned long ago that boys like him were better seen than heard, and right now, being seen was the problem. The circle of guests grew tighter around him. These people, with their perfect lives and endless money, had found their entertainment for the evening. A poor black boy with cleaning supplies, caught where he didn't belong. Samuel's face burned with shame, but he couldn't move. Fear had frozen him in place, the mop his only shield against their cruel amusement. He thought of his mother, probably wondering where he was by now. She had sacrificed so much to keep them together, working jobs that broke her body and spirit just to put food on their table. And here he was, about to destroy everything with his foolish decision to help. The laughter grew louder, more pointed. Samuel closed his eyes, wishing he could disappear entirely. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He was trapped in this circle of cruelty, about to face something that would test every lesson his mother had taught him about dignity, strength, and survival. The worst was yet to come. Clara Whitmore stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots in the sudden quiet. She was the hostess, the queen of this social gathering, and she had just found her evening's entertainment. Her royal blue dress, custom-made in Paris, rustled as she moved closer to the cowering boy. The diamond necklace around her throat caught the light, throwing tiny rainbows across the ceiling. "My goodness," she announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom like a stage performer addressing her audience. "Isn't this precious? They've let the janitor's child inside during our charity gala." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here they were, supposedly raising money for underprivileged children, while mocking one who had wandered into their midst. But irony required self-awareness, and Clara Whitmore had never possessed much of that quality. Samuel finally looked up, meeting her gaze for just a moment before quickly looking away. That brief eye contact was enough for Clara to see something she hadn't expected: intelligence, depth, a spark that didn't belong in her narrow view of what a poor black child should be. "What's your name, boy?" she demanded, though her tone suggested she didn't really care about the answer. "Samuel," he whispered, so quietly that several guests leaned forward to hear. "Samuel," Clara repeated, savoring the name like it was some exotic delicacy. "And what exactly were you doing crawling around our floor, Samuel?" "I was cleaning the spill," he managed, his voice barely audible. "I saw the wine and I thought." "You thought?" Clara's laughter was sharp, cutting. "How wonderful. The helps child thinks. Tell me, Samuel, do you often think about things that don't concern you?" The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. These were people who had everything: money, power, social status. But they were missing something fundamental. Compassion had been bred out of them, replaced by a hunger for entertainment at others' expense. A woman in emerald green silk chimed in. "Clara, you're being too kind. The boy obviously doesn't understand proper behavior. Look at those ridiculous gloves." Samuel's hands, still encased in the oversized yellow rubber gloves, trembled slightly. He tried to shrink further into himself, but there was nowhere to go. The circle of expensive fabric and glittering jewelry had trapped him completely. "Perhaps," said a man with a gray mustache, swirling his brandy, "we should teach him some manners. After all, it is a charity event." More laughter erupted at this suggestion. The idea of teaching manners to a child while simultaneously demonstrating their own complete lack of them seemed to escape everyone present. Clara's eyes lit up with malicious inspiration. She had married into the Whitmore fortune, but she had grown up middle class, always feeling like she had to prove she belonged among the truly wealthy. Humiliating this boy felt like confirmation of her own elevated status. "Samuel," she said, drawing out his name like she was about to offer him a gift, "have you ever seen a piano like this before?" She gestured toward the magnificent Steinway grand that dominated one corner of the ballroom. It was worth more than most people's houses, a perfect example of craftsmanship and artistry. Samuel's gaze flickered toward the instrument, and for just a moment his expression changed. There was something there: recognition, longing, maybe even love. But Clara was too focused on her own performance to notice. "I suppose," she continued, "growing up in your circumstances, you've never had the opportunity to appreciate fine music. This piano has been played by world-renowned artists. It graced concert halls in Vienna before my husband acquired it for our home." She ran her manicured fingers along the piano's edge, her touch possessive and proud. "The wood is seasoned ebony, the keys genuine ivory. The sound it produces is absolutely divine. But of course, you wouldn't understand such things." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His mother had taught him to stay silent when faced with cruelty, to let the storm pass without fighting back. But something about the way Clara was touching that piano, claiming ownership over music itself, stirred something deep inside him. "Can you even read, Samuel?" asked another guest, a thin woman with harsh cheekbones. "I mean, properly read, not just simple words?" The assumption hung in the air like smoke. These people had decided who Samuel was based on his clothes, his skin color, his presence in their world with a mop in his hands. They had written his entire story without knowing a single chapter. Clara sensed the mood in the room shifting toward boredom. She needed to escalate her performance, to give her audience the climax they craved. Her mind raced, searching for the perfect humiliation that would cement her position as the evening's entertainment director. Then inspiration struck, terrible and brilliant at the same time. The trap was about to be set. Clara's smile widened into something predatory as she surveyed her captive audience. The guests had formed a perfect circle around Samuel, their faces eager with anticipation. This was better than any planned entertainment. This was real, raw, and deliciously cruel. "I have a wonderful idea," Clara announced, her voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. "Let's make this educational for our young friend here." She moved to stand directly beside the piano, one hand resting possessively on its polished surface. The gesture was theatrical, calculated to emphasize the vast distance between her world and Samuel's. "You see, Samuel," she began, her tone mockingly sweet. "This instrument represents centuries of culture, refinement, and artistic achievement. It's not just furniture. It's a gateway to beauty that your kind simply cannot comprehend." The phrase, "your kind," hung in the air like a slap. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. They were all complicit now, caught up in the momentum of Clara's cruelty. "Music," she continued, "requires education, breeding, proper upbringing. It demands years of expensive lessons, exposure to high culture, and an inherent understanding of artistic excellence. These are things that money can't simply buy. They must be cultivated from birth." Samuel remained frozen, his small frame dwarfed by the towering adults surrounding him. But something had changed in his posture. His spine had straightened slightly, and his grip on the mop handle had loosened. The yellow gloves seemed less ridiculous now and more like armor. A man in a burgundy jacket laughed. "Clara, you're giving the boy quite an education tonight. Perhaps he'll remember this when he's old enough to appreciate what he witnessed here." "Oh, but we're not finished yet," Clara replied, her eyes glittering with malicious delight. "I want to make this truly memorable." She began to pace around the piano, her heels clicking out a rhythm that seemed to count down to something terrible. The guests followed her movement like spectators at a tennis match, their heads turning in unison. Music is about emotion, Samuel. It's about expressing feelings that are too complex for simple words. It requires a depth of human experience that comes from living a full, rich life surrounded by beauty and culture. Her words were carefully chosen weapons, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. She was describing everything Samuel's life lacked, everything his poverty had denied him. "For instance," she said, striking a single key on the piano. The note rang out pure and clear, filling the ballroom with its perfect tone. "This single note contains more beauty than you've probably experienced in your entire short life." The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Clara had found the perfect way to wound, not just mocking Samuel's circumstances, but denying his very capacity for beauty, for feeling, for human depth. "So you see," she continued, building toward her crescendo, "this piano and everything it represents is completely beyond your world. You might clean around it, but you could never truly understand it." The room was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. Even the servers had stopped moving, sensing that something significant was happening. Clara paused at the piano bench, her hand resting on its velvet cushion. "In fact," she said, her voice dropping to ensure everyone leaned in to hear, "I would bet that you couldn't produce even the simplest melody on this instrument. Not because you lack the physical ability to press keys, but because you lack the soul to understand what music truly is." Samuel's breathing had become shallow, but his eyes were no longer downcast. For the first time since this ordeal began, he was looking directly at Clara, and there was something in his gaze that should have warned her. But Clara was too intoxicated by her own performance to notice. She had reached the moment she had been building toward, the perfect culmination of her evening's entertainment. "So here's what I propose," she announced, her voice rising triumphantly. "A little wager, if you will. Something to make this truly interesting." The guests pressed closer, sensing the approaching climax of Clara's show. Some were smiling in anticipation. Others looked vaguely uncomfortable but remained silent. Clara placed both hands on the piano, leaning forward dramatically. "If you can play this piano, I mean, really play it, not just bang on the keys like a child with a toy. If you can produce actual music that demonstrates even the slightest understanding of what this instrument represents." She paused for effect, letting the impossibility of her challenge sink in. "Then I will adopt you myself." The words exploded across the ballroom like a bomb. Gasps echoed off the marble walls. Several guests actually laughed out loud at the audacity of the proposition. The idea was so preposterous, so insulting, that even some of Clara's supporters looked shocked. "Adopt him," someone whispered, as if he were a stray animal. But Clara wasn't finished. The cruelty of her offer was only part of the trap. "Of course," she added, her smile now purely venomous, "when you fail, and you will fail, you'll admit in front of everyone here that you and your kind have no place in civilized society. You'll acknowledge that you belong in the servants' quarters, cleaning up after your betters." The trap was perfect. Samuel couldn't win because Clara refused to believe he could win. And if he refused to try, she would claim victory anyway, having proven his cowardice along with his ignorance. The boy stood there, still holding his mop, surrounded by the cruelest people he had ever encountered. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Stay invisible, baby. Keep your head down. Don't give them any reason to notice you." But it was too late for invisibility. They had already seen him. The only question now was what they would see when he made his choice. Samuel looked down at his hands, still encased in the ridiculous yellow gloves that had become a symbol of his humiliation. Around him, the circle of wealthy guests waited with barely contained excitement, like spectators at a gladiator match. Clara stood beside the piano, her smile sharp as a blade, certain of her victory. The boy's mind raced back through time, past the hunger and the exhaustion, past the cramped apartment and his mother's tears. He remembered a different place, a different time. His mother's music studio, small and cramped but filled with love and possibility. The old upright piano that had been their most precious possession, its keys yellowed with age but still capable of magic. "Don't just press the keys, baby," his mother's voice whispered across the years. "Feel them. Let them tell your story." Samuel had been 4 when she first lifted him onto the piano bench. By 6, he was playing simple melodies. By 8, he was composing his own pieces, his small fingers finding harmonies that made his mother cry with pride. Then came the eviction notice, the foreclosure, the desperate scramble for survival that left no room for music. But the music hadn't left him. It had lived inside him through 3 years of silence. 3 years of watching his mother scrub floors instead of teaching children to find beauty in 8/8 keys. Slowly, Samuel began pulling off the rubber gloves. The gesture seemed to take forever, each finger emerging like he was shedding an old skin. The guests chuckled at his deliberate movements, interpreting his careful actions as hesitation. Having second thoughts. Clara taunted, "It's not too late to admit you don't belong here." Samuel didn't respond. He folded the gloves carefully and placed them on the floor beside the mop. Then he walked to the piano bench, his small frame dwarfed by the magnificent instrument. The bench was too high for him. He had to climb up, his feet barely touching the floor once he was seated. The guests' laughter grew louder at this comical sight, a tiny boy in patched clothes trying to reach the keys of a concert grand. But when Samuel's fingers touched the ivory keys, something electric happened. The laughter didn't stop immediately, but it changed quality, becoming uncertain. There was something in the boy's posture, something in the way he held his hands, that suggested this wasn't going to unfold as they expected. Samuel closed his eyes and let his fingers find their home. The first note rang out, clear and pure, cutting through the ballroom chatter like a silver bell. It was followed by another, then another, each one perfectly placed, building something beautiful from the silence. The laughter began to fade. What emerged from the piano wasn't the clumsy banging Clara had expected. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Samuel's small hands moved across the keys with impossible grace, his fingers stretching to reach octaves that should have been beyond his span. The transformation was miraculous. The frightened boy with the mop disappeared, replaced by a young artist communicating in the universal language of music. Every note spoke of loss, of longing, of dreams deferred but not destroyed. The melody wove through the ballroom like golden thread, connecting hearts that had forgotten how to feel. Clara's mouth fell open. This wasn't possible. Poor children didn't play Chopin. Janitors' sons didn't understand the subtle dynamics of classical music. Yet here was Samuel, his eyes still closed, his body swaying slightly as he poured 3 years of silence into this single performance. The guests stood frozen, their cruel laughter trapped in their throats. They had come expecting to witness a humiliation, but instead they were experiencing something transcendent. The music stripped away their pretensions, their assumptions, their comfortable prejudices, leaving them face to face with a truth they weren't prepared to accept. Samuel's hands found the piece's most challenging passage, where the melody splits between both hands in a cascade of interweaving harmonies. His mother had worked with him for months to master this section, and muscle memory guided him through it flawlessly. The piano sang under his touch, each note perfectly articulated, each phrase shaped with the sensitivity of a master musician. One woman in the crowd began to cry, though she couldn't have explained why. The music was doing something to her, opening doors in her heart that had been locked for years. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing that everything they thought they knew about this boy, about themselves, about the natural order of their world, was crumbling with each perfect note. As Samuel moved into the piece's final movement, his playing became even more expressive. This wasn't just technical proficiency. This was artistry of the highest order. He was telling his story through Chopin's notes, speaking of poverty and hunger and the love of a mother who sacrificed everything for her son's dreams. The last chord rang out, hanging in the air like a prayer. Samuel opened his eyes and lifted his hands from the keys. The ballroom was completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the only sound was the echo of music fading into memory. Then, from the back of the room, came a voice that changed everything. "Samuel." His mother stood in the doorway, her maid's uniform wrinkled from a long day's work, her face white with shock and fear. She had come looking for her son, and instead found him at the center of a scene she couldn't begin to understand. The spell was broken. Reality came crashing back like a wave, and with it, all the complications of what had just occurred. Maria Martinez stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs as she took in the impossible scene before her. Her son, her brilliant, beautiful son, who hadn't touched a piano in 3 years, sat at the Whitmore's concert grand, surrounded by the city's elite, like some kind of prodigy on display. Terror and pride warred in her chest. Pride because Samuel had just played Chopin with a skill that would have impressed conservatory professors. Terror because she knew exactly how dangerous this moment was for both of them. "Samuel," she whispered again, hurrying forward through the crowd of stunned guests. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay in the quarters." She reached him and placed protective hands on his shoulders, her touch gentle but urgent. Up close, she could see the tears on his cheeks, tears she wasn't sure were from the music or from the ordeal he had endured before it. Clara Whitmore finally found her voice, though it came out as a croak. Where'd he learn to play like that?" Maria's jaw tightened. She had spent 3 years in this house, invisible and silent, cleaning the floors these people walked on without a thought for the woman who knelt to scrub them. Now they wanted answers, as if her son's talent was somehow their business. "I taught him," she said simply, her voice carrying a dignity that commanded attention despite her maid's uniform. "You?" The question came from multiple voices at once, disbelief dripping from the word. Maria straightened her spine, one hand still protective on Samuel's shoulder. "I have a master's degree in music performance from the Cleveland Institute. I was a concert pianist before life changed our circumstances." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. These people had spent the evening mocking a child and his mother, never bothering to learn anything about their lives, their history, their humanity. "I had a studio in downtown Cleveland," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I taught classical piano to children from wealthy families. Your children, probably, or children just like them. Samuel was my youngest and most gifted student." An older gentleman in a gray suit stepped forward, his face pale. "Maria Martinez? You're Maria Martinez?" She nodded, recognizing something in his expression. "My daughter studied with you for 5 years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca Thornton. You were the best teacher she ever had. She still talks about the lessons you gave her." The dominoes began falling then, as other guests realized they were standing in the presence of someone they had heard of, respected even, in her professional life. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the talented musician their children had raved about be the same woman they had ignored while she cleaned their floors? Clara's face had gone from pale to flushed red as the full scope of her mistake became clear. She had built her evening's entertainment around humiliating 2 people whose story she had never bothered to learn. Worse, she had made her cruel proposition in front of dozens of witnesses. "The studio went bankrupt during the recession," Maria explained, her voice steady but touched with old pain. "I lost everything. The building, the piano, my reputation. I brought Samuel here tonight because I had no choice. The babysitter canceled, and I couldn't afford to miss work." She looked down at her son, pride shining through her exhaustion. "He hasn't played in 3 years. We sold our piano to pay rent before I took this job. But music doesn't leave you. It lives in your hands, in your heart." Samuel finally spoke, his voice small but clear. "I tried to help clean the spill by the piano. I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't cause trouble, baby," Maria said firmly, then looked up at the crowd of watching faces. The trouble was already here. The weight of her words settled over the room, like a blanket. These people, who had spent their evening in acts of casual cruelty, were being forced to confront the reality of their actions. A talented child and his accomplished mother had been reduced to objects of ridicule, simply because poverty had changed their circumstances. Dr. Harrison, the older gentleman who had recognized Maria's name, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Martinez, I owe you an apology. We all do. What happened here tonight was inexcusable," finished another voice. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the grande dame of local society, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I've been coming to charity galas for 40 years, supposedly helping children. Tonight I watched a roomful of adults mock a child for being poor. We should be ashamed." Clara stood silent, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The cruel proposition she had made now seemed not just heartless but absurd. How could she have offered to adopt a child who already had a loving, accomplished mother? Samuel slipped his hand into his mother's, and Maria squeezed it tight. They were still the same people they had been an hour ago, still struggling, still fighting to survive in a world that judged them by their bank account rather than their character. But something fundamental had shifted in the room. "We should go," Maria said quietly, beginning to guide Samuel toward the servants' entrance. "Wait," Dr. Harrison called out. "Please, Mrs. Martinez, I know this is presumptuous given what just happened, but would you consider teaching again? My granddaughter needs a piano teacher, and after hearing Samuel play, after remembering what you did for Rebecca." Other voices joined in, offering lessons, opportunities, connections. The same people who had laughed at Samuel's appearance were now competing to associate themselves with his talent. Maria paused, looking back at the room full of faces that now showed something resembling respect. The irony wasn't lost on her. It had taken her son's public humiliation and triumph to remind these people of her worth. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her dignity intact despite everything they had endured. As mother and son walked toward the door, Samuel looked back once at the piano that had been both his torture and his salvation. The music was still there, waiting for him. It had never really left. Behind them, the ballroom fell into subdued conversation as the guests grappled with what they had witnessed. Some would forget by morning, returning to their comfortable assumptions about class and worth. Others would remember this night for the rest of their lives, the night a 10-year-old boy reminded them that talent, dignity, and humanity could exist anywhere. Clara Whitmore stood alone by the piano, her evening's entertainment having turned into her evening's education. She had wanted to prove her superiority over a poor child and his mother. Instead, she had proven only the poverty of her own character. The music echoed in the empty spaces between them all, a reminder that beauty and worth cannot be measured by wealth alone.